Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, new weapons are fun, and on my journey through this lovely DLC, there have been a fair number of them that have caught my eye, but few of them were as enticing as this, the ancient meteoric or greatsword. Beautiful on first glance, but far more so once you realize all the little bits that make it even more special, and hey, just for the sake of showing it, this is a screenshot of just a freeze frame of it in the middle of its Ash 4. How cool is that? And, you know, it's worth saying it is also a little bit bugged right now. That said, today I'm going to show you my full build with this weapon, and quick spoiler warning that to show this weapon off, I will be using footage of a couple of Remembrance bosses, both Divine Beast, who I am confident everyone knows about at this point, but also the Remembrance boss of Castle Ensis as well. That out of the way then, we'll talk about what makes the weapon strong, and then we'll go over how to actually get it for anything that is new from the DLC, as I will be assuming that you have the components that are from the base game. Then we'll just talk about how to play the build properly. Starting off then, the weapon has two main special aspects to it. The first is that its strong and charged strong attack is a thrust to begin the combo, unlike any other colossal sword, which makes it unique to begin with, as thrusts are generally considered to be a really strong attack type due to the high range that they have from poking forwards with momentum, and easy ability to catch and hit an enemy because of the target tracking in the game, as long as they aren't, trying to parry you, of course. Thrust attacks are easy to parry. The strong attack is also, though, very, very strong damage-wise. It does a lot of damage. Nothing is actually lost from it being a thrust instead of a slash, so this is just a positive and a great thing overall. The other main thing about this weapon is its unique weapon skill, White Light Charge. When you press the input, after a brief delay, you charge forward a pretty long distance with a thrusting forward weapon attack. This does about half of the damage of an uncharged heavy attack, so really quite potent for its range, and it also has reasonable stagger value as well, and a little bit of poise boost that lets you tank through attacks while you're doing this too. Then after you finish the charge, you can press the input a second time to do an explosion of white lightning that does really solid damage and knocks down smaller enemies fully. Not like only trash though, completely. I mean smaller enemies as in things that aren't bosses or the very highest poise of little guys, because this thing even knocks the fire knights around quite easily, even the giant knights with the hammers in the first area. That said, after testing a ton of different things for the better part of an hour, I found out a lot of interesting things about how the weapon functions, how you can boost it, and the majority of my findings is that there is no way to turn this into a one-trick pony. But that is totally unnecessary to do because it's so just generally strong. The damage of the unique skill doesn't count as lightning in any way, despite visually being white lightning, and so none of the lightning boosting things affect it at all. Instead, it seems to be about 90% physical damage and 10% magic damage, which is about the same as the base weapon hits themselves that you see with the direct stats. What's then interesting about the stats then is that the magic damage barely scales at all. Most of both the strength and arcane scaling of this weapon go directly into its physical damage, and that applies to the Ash of War as well. Though in my testing, while mixed strength and arcane actually resulted in highest potential attack power of the basic weapon hits, strength does have a larger effect on the weapon skill itself than arcane seems to. At this point, it's worth noting as well there does seem to be a slight bug for this weapon, where a lot of console players specifically are reporting that it both has different stat requirements for them, including requiring intelligence to be able to use it, which it just doesn't on PC, and also that the arcane scaling works differently on their weapon as well. I can't speak for console players' version of this, but either way, you would still build this weapon the way that I am right now. The biggest change would just be shuffling some of the stats around as much as you need to in the end. All that said, let's talk about everything that we use to actually make this weapon sing the song of its people. Starting off, you of course need the weapon itself, and this is in the ruined Forge of Starfall Past in the Scadu region, which is located just southwest of the Moorth Rune Site of Grace. Once you're inside of here, simply follow this path that I'm going to show you for the fastest way to get specifically this weapon. this weapon then, we are also using the Dragon Communion Seal. This is mostly because it scales with Arcane. Technically speaking, the Clawmark Seal scales better with our current stats, but the Dragon Seal works better specifically due to the fact that it scales with Arcane, which means any statuses that are applied from incantations that you cast with this seal will also scale the buildup. And so we pair this with Swarm of Flies as a spell just as a nice source of bleed buildup, as bleed is still quite strong and we have an arcane stat requirement for the build anyways, so we might as well. You can use other seals if you don't want Swarm of Flies, of course. That's just a little bonus that you can use though. For your armor then, we actually have a specific helmet that we will honestly be recommending for the vast majority of builds in Shadow of the Erdtree probably, which is the Fire Knight Helm. This is essentially a mini Erdtree's favor talisman, but just on your helmet, boosting your maximum health, your stamina, and your equip load by a small but non-negligible amount, somewhere around 2% bonus maximum health, and right around 4% maximum stamina and equip load. So it's extremely potent over just, wearing a regular helmet, but not at all required to make the build function. So this is just a choice whether you want it or not. If you think the fashion's not right for you, then of course you don't have to wear it by any means, but to actually get this then, you need to farm it from the Fire Knight enemies that are wearing it, as it is a random chance drop. Theoretically, it's supposed to drop from any of the Fire Knight enemies. However, I farmed the one that is right down the elevator from the Storehouse first floor Grace for about 45 minutes. This is the easiest Fire Knight to actually farm. I got every other drop in the table about 5 times except for the helmet. Then I switched to the Knight right beside the Storehouse 7th floor site of Grace and got it after 10 minutes. So maybe that's just RNG being RNG, maybe it's not. I'd recommend just doing the Knight on the 7th floor site of Grace because it's the one that I can personally confirm drops the helmet after a few kills. However, if anyone in the comments has seen this helmet drop from the lower one, the one from the Storehouse first floor site of Grace is technically a faster loop. For the rest of your armor then, it's just completely up to you, though I should mention that the Spellblade armor set from the base game does technically boost the damage, as it boosts magic damage, Ashes of War, but because the weapon skill's damage is only like 10% magic, the actual boost from this is so ridiculously tiny that it isn't really worth locking yourself into a low poise and damage negation setup by any means, but I do feel that I should mention that that's a thing regardless. Then let's talk about your talismans. There are 2 things that we are focusing on boosting with this build. One is the Ash of War, the other is the Thrusting Strong Attack. As mentioned, this doesn't actually do lightning damage, so Lightning Scorpion Charm does nothing. Magic Scorpion Charm technically increases the damage a little bit, but like the Spellblade said, it is just such a negligible amount of bonus that it gives you that it just isn't worth the negatives that the talisman gives you. What we actually use then are the Shard of Alexander, which is just a straight up 15% bonus to damage with weapon skills, and this applies to both inputs, so it's honestly really quite good. Next up we have the Carrion Filigreed Talisman. This reduces the FP cost of weapon skills by 25%, again counting for both inputs, which is quite nice. Then past that we have the brand new Two-Handed Sword Talisman. This boosts your damage with all two-handed weapon attacks by 15%. Sadly, it has no effect on Ashes of War, so it doesn't do anything for the weapon skill itself, but this does boost both our light and strong attacks, which is lovely. To get this one for yourself then, it is in the Scadu Altus region in the lower west side of the area. I'll show you how to get over there from the Morth Runes here. Just follow this path, and you want to end up at the Templetown Runes site of Grace that I've got marked on my map here. Then once you are at the grace that I had marked in this area, it's just a short walk over to the Templetown ruins, and this can be a little bit tricky to actually get inside of if you don't know the right way in, but just follow my route here and it'll take you inside and right through to the chest where the talisman would be. Then your final slot is a sort of flex slot. For pure damage, the Axe Talisman is great here. 10% bonus damage with charged attacks comes in handy, as that's one of our strongest attacks already anyways. You could instead do something like Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for bonus physical damage reduction, Erdtree's Favor +2 for more HP, stamina, or equip load, or any other sort of utility talisman that you might value more than 10% damage on specifically charged strong attacks. It's really up to you. Past that, I do want to mention the Iron Jar Aromatic Consumable. It's not at all required to make the build work by any means, but because of the sheer mobility on the first input of the Ash of War, you can use this item for the insane poise that it gives you, and then just use the first input of the Ash of War as your movement essentially to remove the negative of the item. This is a more resource intensive playstyle, but it is an option for you to bring for trying to like cheese a boss with this setup even further if you're really struggling with something. Finally then, let's talk about the actual spells that we're using then. For our buffs, we have the classic combination of Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Golden Vow is a 15% all damage buff and 10% damage negation buff for 80 seconds after casting, and Flame Grant Me Strength is a 20% boost to physical and fire damage that lasts for 30 seconds. Before a boss fight or any difficult enemy at all, you want to use Golden Vow, then drink your Wondrous Flask of Physic, then use Flame Grant Me Strength, drink your Mana Flask, and then you can begin the fight. Finally, we have Swarm of Flies, which I mentioned earlier. This is just nice for being able to trigger bleed on occasion with their arcane scaling, and you can even play off of this and use something like Bloodlord's Exaltation as a talisman, or the White Mask Helmet, which gives you damage boosts after getting a bleed on an enemy if you're, against a particularly bleed weak boss. No matter what, I recommend starting your boss fight by just sending out one of these, but the base spell itself is also reasonably good for the light flinches that it can get to smaller enemies too, even outside of bosses. And then, of course, you can just use any other spells that you'd like, either for utility or just variety that fit within these stats. As for our Wondrous Flask of Physic then, I 100% recommend using the Spiked Cracked tier for bonus damage to charged attacks. It's just the one that most consistently affects our damage by the largest amount, and then the other slot is pretty much free to use as you'd like. The Magic Boosting tier has a really small effect, like 3% damage increase, but it is still a damage increase. There's the tier that makes it easier to break enemies' stances, which is great with the strong attacks. There's the new Infinite Stamina tier, or the one that restores health on hit. There's also the one that gives you Enhanced Guard Deflects. There's lots of good utility options these days, really, that you can choose from for this slot. Then for our final step, let's just talk about our actual stat spread at level 150. I should mention that I am at Scadutree Blessing level 10 in all of this footage, so right smack dab in the middle. First things first, you want 60 Vigor. It was possible to run less than that before the DLC, but things hit so hard now, I just never recommend being lower than 60. Then you want Strength up to 54. This is a very calculated number, as when you two-hand a weapon, your effective strength for it is increased by 50%. 54 times 1.5 is 81, which is just slightly past the proper soft cap for strength scaling at 80. We are of course also going to be two-handing this weapon whenever we aren't casting spells. Then you want to hit 19 arcane specifically, as that is the minimum requirement to use this weapon. You need 10 dexterity if you don't have that from base stats, and then if you are on console, you also need a few points of intelligence due to the weird bugged different stat requirements, so adjust as necessary if so, but then past that you just want 25 faith so you can use all of our incantations, and then you should have a number of points remaining to split as you please between mind, endurance, and further boost to arcane. Endurance is stamina, which is good, but more importantly for this setup, it also lets you get heavier armor on, which is great because you can trade hits with the Ash of War to do big damage damage if you aren't taking too much damage in return. Mind lets you cast the skill more. With our current setup at 20 mind, you can cast the full double input 4 times, and then you can still also cast the little charge 1 time after that, which honestly you will do relatively frequently just because it's great for movement. Then you just want to put more points in arcane if you want some extra damage scaling on top of the rest of it. That's all that really does. The weapon skill doesn't seem to scale too well with arcane though compared to strength, but the weapon hits themselves do scale well with arcane, so any extra points here will make their mark on your actual light and strong attacks if you want to boost those, at least in comparison to, anything else. As far as any tips on actually using this build yourself then, before any difficult fight, make sure you apply your buffs. We have them for a reason. Then my favorite combo, especially as an opener, is the first input of the Ash of War, which uses very little FP and stamina, and then instead of doing the second input, instead cancel out into a heavy charged attack for massive damage and stagger. Most enemies don't react fast enough to the fact that you are a foot away from them to avoid charged strong attacks at the very beginning of a fight, and that tends to do a ton of damage if you can get it in the opening. Outside of that opening moment though, you want to take advantage of the bonus poise you get from both inputs of the weapon skill to sort of trade with bosses as necessary. You don't want to tank their biggest hits, obviously, you need to learn their moveset at least a little bit, but you can definitely trade smaller slashes for 4,000 damage a pop if you do this right. Otherwise, just find your moments, play around with the fact that you can engage from miles away in an instant with the first input of a weapon skill the second the boss gives you even the slightest bit of clearance, and remember, anytime you have the space to get off a charged strong attack, you will inflict just massive stance damage and get yourself closer to a free crit. That just about does it for today then, everyone. Your full ancient, meteoric, or greatsword build. It's strong enough to absolutely dust remembrance bosses. Once you work out their patterns enough to find some openings, it closes gaps from miles away, it can be used to dodge, it does absolutely massive poise damage, and also does great damage itself in general. And importantly, it isn't just a one-trick pony either. The Ash of War and Strong Attack are both nearly equally as capable as each other, and they even function together well. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully you enjoy using this build for yourself too if you try it out in-game. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.